Imagine waking up tomorrow to headlines claiming that the US dollar is no longer the world's most powerful currency. Financial markets are in turmoil. Social media is flooded with predictions of America's economic collapse. Influencers insist that a brand new BRICS currency has arrived and that the dollar's reign is officially over. It's an attention-grabbing story. There's just one problem. It's not true. Despite countless viral videos and sensational headlines, there is no physical BRICS currency replacing the US dollar today. In fact, leaders within the BRICS bloc have repeatedly acknowledged that creating a shared currency would be an enormously complex challenge that remains far from reality. But dismissing the entire story would be an even bigger mistake. Because while the world debates an imaginary banknote, something far more significant is already happening behind the scenes. Countries representing a large share of the world's population and an increasing portion of global trade are quietly changing how they do business. Instead of relying on the US dollar for every international transaction, they're increasingly settling trade using their own national currencies. At the same time, they're building new payment systems, expanding financial partnerships, and reducing their dependence on institutions that have long been dominated by the West. These developments won't eliminate the dollar overnight, but they could gradually reshape the global financial system over the coming decades. So, what exactly is BRICS trying to achieve? Why are more countries looking for alternatives to the dollar? And is the world truly witnessing the beginning of a new monetary era, or simply another geopolitical headline that will eventually fade away? Let's separate fact from fiction and uncover what is really happening. To understand why BRICS is searching for alternatives, we first need to understand how the US dollar became so dominant in the first place. Its position wasn't created by chance. Following the end of World War II, representatives from dozens of countries gathered at the Bretton Woods Conference in 1944 to rebuild the global financial system. The agreement placed the US dollar at the center of international finance, with many currencies linked to the dollar and the dollar itself backed by America's vast gold reserves. Although that gold standard eventually ended, the dollar retained its central role. Another important development followed during the 1970s. Most international oil transactions began to be priced and settled in US dollars. Since every country needs energy, governments and businesses around the world naturally accumulated dollars to purchase oil and conduct international trade. Over time, this created a powerful cycle. Global companies borrowed in dollars. Central banks held dollar reserves. International contracts were written in dollars. Banks built payment networks around dollars. Investors viewed U.S. Treasury securities as one of the safest assets in the world. The more people used the dollar, the more valuable it became as the global standard. This gave the United States significant economic advantages. Strong global demand for dollars helped keep borrowing costs relatively low while giving Washington considerable influence over international finance. For decades, this system appeared almost unchallenged. Then, geopolitical tensions began changing how many governments viewed financial dependence on the dollar. One event, in particular, accelerated that shift. For many governments, the desire to reduce dependence on the US dollar wasn't driven by ideology. It was driven by risk. That risk became much more visible after Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022. In response, Western nations imposed sweeping financial sanctions. Hundreds of billions of dollars in Russia's foreign reserves held abroad were frozen, and several major Russian banks were cut off from SWIFT, the global financial messaging network that enables banks around the world to communicate and process international payments. For Western governments, these measures demonstrated the power of economic sanctions. For many other countries, they demonstrated something else. They highlighted how deeply the global financial system depends on institutions largely influenced by the United States and its allies. Whether countries agreed or disagreed with the sanctions wasn't the only issue. Many policymakers began asking a different question. What if one day we find ourselves in a similar situation? If your foreign reserves are largely held in dollars, if your international trade depends on dollar-based banking, if your payment infrastructure relies on systems controlled by other nations, then geopolitical disagreements could potentially become financial vulnerabilities. This concern didn't appear overnight, nor was it limited to BRICS countries. Around the world, governments began discussing how to diversify their financial relationships and reduce dependence on any single currency or payment network. This wasn't about replacing the dollar tomorrow. It was about creating alternatives. And that's where the BRICS strategy truly begins. One of the biggest misconceptions surrounding BRICS is that its members are secretly preparing to unveil a single currency capable of replacing the US dollar. The reality is both less dramatic and, in many ways, more practical. Instead of creating one shared currency, BRICS members are gradually encouraging trade in their own national currencies. Consider how many international transactions traditionally worked. Imagine Brazil exporting soybeans to China. For decades, even though neither country used the US dollar domestically, the transaction often passed through the dollar anyway. Brazilian reais would first be exchanged into US dollars. Those dollars might move through international banks before finally being converted into Chinese yuan. Each conversion added costs, increased exposure to exchange rate fluctuations, and reinforced the dollar's role as the world's financial middleman. Today, some of those transactions are taking a different route. Instead of converting through dollars, businesses can increasingly settle trade directly in yuan and reais. Similar arrangements have emerged elsewhere. India has explored purchasing energy using rupees. Russia has increasingly relied on yuan in portions of its international trade. Several BRICS members have signed bilateral agreements designed to expand trade using local currencies rather than automatically defaulting to the dollar. While these transactions still represent only part of global trade, they illustrate a broader trend. The goal isn't necessarily to eliminate the dollar. It's to reduce dependence on it wherever practical. At the same time, BRICS countries are investing in alternative financial infrastructure. China has expanded the cross-border interbank payment system, commonly known as CIPS, while Russia has continued developing its own financial messaging system after facing restrictions from Western networks. These systems aren't replacing SWIFT globally, but they provide additional options for participating countries. Another important development has been reserve diversification. Around the world, many central banks have increased their purchases of gold in recent years. Gold doesn't depend on any single country's monetary policy, making it an attractive reserve asset during periods of geopolitical uncertainty. For BRICS nations, holding more gold alongside diversified currency reserves offers another way to reduce concentration risk. Taken together, these changes may appear gradual, but history often shows that major shifts in global finance begin with small adjustments that accumulate over many years. The question is no longer whether countries are exploring alternatives. They already are. The bigger question is whether those alternatives can ever rival the system that has dominated global finance for nearly 8 decades. For all the headlines predicting the end of dollar dominance, there's one important reality that often gets overlooked. Building an alternative financial system is one thing. Replacing the world's primary reserve currency is something entirely different. The first obstacle is the diversity of the BRICS alliance itself. Unlike the European Union, BRICS is not a political union with shared institutions or a common economic policy. Its members have different political systems, different economic priorities, and sometimes competing strategic interests. China is the bloc's largest economy by a significant margin, while countries like India, Brazil, and South Africa place great importance on maintaining their own monetary independence. That creates a difficult question. If a common BRICS currency were ever introduced, who would control it? Who would decide interest rates? Who would manage inflation? Who would respond during a financial crisis? These are the same questions every central bank must answer, and reaching agreement among countries with very different priorities will be extraordinarily difficult. There are also geopolitical challenges. China and India, despite being major BRICS members, continue to have unresolved border disputes and compete for influence across Asia. Russia faces sanctions from many Western nations, while Brazil and India maintain extensive economic relationships with both East and West. These differences don't prevent cooperation, but they do make deep monetary integration far more complicated. Another major challenge is trust. The U.S. dollar remains dominant not only because of America's economic size, but because global investors have confidence in the depth and liquidity of U.S. financial markets. Every day, trillions of dollars move through highly developed American capital markets. Investors know they can buy or sell assets quickly, access transparent pricing, and operate within a well-established legal framework. Many emerging economies, including several BRICS members, still maintain varying degrees of capital controls or government intervention in their financial systems. While these policies may serve domestic objectives, they also make some international investors more cautious about holding large amounts of those currencies. For these reasons, most economists believe the dollar is unlikely to lose its dominant position in the near future. But maintaining dominance doesn't necessarily mean maintaining exclusivity, and that distinction may define the next chapter of global finance. So where does all of this leave us? Despite the dramatic headlines, there is no evidence that a unified BRICS currency is on the verge of replacing the U.S. dollar. The dollar continues to dominate global trade, international reserves, and financial markets. Its network effects, institutional support, and deep capital markets remain unmatched. At the same time, ignoring the changes taking place would be equally misleading. More countries are settling trade in local currencies. Alternative payment systems are expanding. Central banks are diversifying their reserves. And governments are increasingly seeking ways to reduce dependence on any single financial system. Taken individually, each of these developments may seem modest. Together, they point toward a gradual transformation of the global monetary landscape. Rather than moving from one dominant currency to another, the world may be entering a more multipolar financial era, one where different regions rely on different currencies, payment networks, and trading relationships. That transition, if it continues, is likely to unfold over decades rather than months. For investors, businesses, and policymakers, understanding these shifts matters. A more fragmented financial system could bring greater currency volatility, changing trade patterns and new opportunities, as well as new risks. History rarely changes overnight. The end of one era and the beginning of another usually happen gradually, often without most people noticing until the transformation is already well underway. Whether BRICS ultimately reshapes the global financial system or simply accelerates its evolution remains to be seen. But one thing is already clear. The conversation is no longer about whether countries are exploring alternatives to the dollar. The conversation is about how far those alternatives will go. If you enjoyed this documentary and want more fact-based breakdowns of the world's biggest business, finance, and geopolitical stories, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next documentary.